and the SAAF were allocated 136 Spitfire Mark 9s, of which 50 was Mark 9Es with the Merlin 63, and 86 were HF Mark 9Es with Merlin 70 engines. Now, 53 of them were flown to the Union on different dates in 1947. At the time, they also flew down 4 Venturas from 60 Squadron, as well as 2 Dakotas, which was codenamed 6841 and 6856. The rest were all shipped in 1948, sometimes 7 and sometimes 1 plane per ship. So quite a lot of shipping going on there. On arrival, all these Spitfires were sent to Snake Valley for servicing and conversion to operational status. So by early 48, the 1 and 2 Squadron were up to strength, with both squadrons then donating 2 aircraft each to 35 Squadron in Durban for maritime duties that they shared with Harvards, Oxfords and Venturas. But there is reason to believe that they were actually assigned to the 35 Squadron just to bring up the numbers and to prevent the closing down of the base at Stamford Hill. So there was an accident as well as reassignment that brought the Spitfire rolled at 35 Squadron to a standstill by June 49, and they were returned to number 1 and 2 Squadron. During the late 40s, the Spitfires were regulars at air shows, or as they were called, air pageants. Even as far as Bulawayo and Lorenzo Marx. I think we're all old enough to know that that's the real names of these places. So in August of 1948, some Spitfires were moved to Langebaan as an introduction to bombing, gunnery, and navigation school. And that grew to 64 Spitfires over the next 6 years. The offer of a Spitfire squadron to United Nations in 1950 was dropped in favor of Mustangs due to uniformity with the United States Army Air Forces in Korea. So number 2 Squadron trained on these Spitfires before they converted to Mustangs in Korea. With the focus on supporting number 2 Squadron, between 1915 and 52, most Spitfires were rotated to the Air Operations School. There were, however, 34 Spitfires involved in accidents during 1950 alone, and this started reaching the papers. So after 3 accidents in 4 days, in June of 1951, the press started asking questions that could no longer be ignored, and the matter even came before Parliament after a public outcry. Now that is what these Spitfires looked like at the time. So by January of 53, the days of piston engine frontline fighters were over. 1 Squadron had begun taking Vampires on strength from October in 52, and they were flying both aircraft at the same time for a period, while the Spitfires were withdrawn systematically. Old legends die hard, however, and this following story became folklore at the time. James Sweeney happened to talk to Tank Wendell of his preference for the Spitfire over the Vampire, which did not go down well with Tank, and a challenge was issued and accepted in the bar, I would assume. Each of the 2 pilots would choose an aircraft, and the first one to reach 30,000 feet would be declared the winner. Old Horse, however, knew that the Vampire took 11 minutes 15 seconds to reach that height, and he was pretty sure he could beat it. So on 27th of June 53, the Vampire and the Spitfire lined up at the runway at Langebaan and thundered into the sky. So Tank said, I flew at 18-pound boost for 5 minutes, then down to 12 pounds boost, and I reached 25,000 feet in 6 minutes and 8 seconds, reaching 30,000 feet in 8 minutes and 12 seconds, and the Vampire arrived in 11 minutes and 15 seconds. Tank didn't say much after the landing. That was the OK Corral fight that. So the Spitfire beat that Vampire all the way to 30,000. With a number of bodies and parts around, it's incredible it wasn't even considered to preserve more of these planes. On the 8th of June 1954, the Secretary of Defense put up 58 aircraft, all serviceable or repairable, as well as 16 Merlin 63s and 11 Merlin 70 engines for sale, awaiting tenders and sold foot stewards and mostly as scrap. Some of these planes ended up as gate guards or scrapyard guards, as that one in Maitland that we all know. Some ended up overseas as well, but a small number did survive. So the Saxon World Museum of Military History, their aircraft was delivered to the RAF as JF294 in January 1943. Was flown from Cairo to Cape Town for exhibition in March 44 and delivered to the SAAF as 5501 and displayed at the museum as SAAF number 5501 from 1948 until now. The Spitfire Mark 8 at the museum has extended wingtips and a beam metal finish. It's not silver painted, with the rivets standing out in a darker color. The fabric control surfaces, like the elevators and the rudder, are painted silver. Spitfire displayed the number 5501 on the side, and according to Wikipedia, this is its South African Air Force serial number. The original serial number is JF294. Delivery was 19 January 43 with the Merlin 66. In October 43, transferred to the SAAF and then flew non-stop. Well, not non-stop, but flew from Cairo to Cape Town in March 1944. So that is the plane in the Saxon World Museum. Beautiful Mark 8 retractable tailwheel. Obviously, they're flying with that 90-gallon extra range tank. Then Evelyn, that we all saw in South Africa in the 80s, is ordered from Castle Bromwich in February of 42. It was powered by a Merlin 63. Delivered the 6th maintenance unit, Bryce Norton, in July 43, and then forwarded to 47 maintenance for shipment to Casablanca, and then allocated to the United States Army Air Forces, but returned to the SAAF to the RAF in May 44. It was then stored until it was selected for sale to the SAAF and loaded on the Clan Campbell in 1948 September. Got the serial number 5601 and went into storage at 15 Air Depot until it was sold in 54 to a hospital for handicapped children, where it remained until it was bought by Larry Barnett and Alan Lurie for 20 Rand in 1967. A Reed 20 Rand in 1967 is about $10. After an extensive restoration over an 8-year period with the help from Atlas, the engine burst into life on September 1975, and the first flight occurred on 29th of September. Evelyn became the star of many air shows until a slight mishap in 84 with some damage to the propeller and the cowling. It was repaired and was flying again during 1986. The rumor started of the aircraft being sold, and in August of 86, it was shipped to Santa Monica and repainted in the famous Johnny Johnson JEJ color scheme. In late 99, the Spitfire was purchased by Rolls-Royce and donated to a flying museum in Brazil. So that's the 40 Squadron WR that we know as Evelyn and knew as Evelyn. AXK was the 5,556 Mark 9 built at Castle Bromwich, powered by a Merlin 70. It was immediately put into storage. Obviously, in May 1945, it didn't fly what wasn't necessary. Selected for sale to the Union and then flown by a SAAF pilot from Egypt to South Africa and taken on charge in 48. Was involved in a collision with another Spitfire in 49 and repaired. Crashed again into a drone cable and repaired, sent back to 1 Squadron, and eventually was put on static display at Waterkloof for 23 years. By 1978, the value was recognized and she was shipped to storage in Nigeria and ultimately sold to David Price in the mid-80s. A donation of 100,000 Rand from a technology company kickstarted the rebuild, and a Merlin 63 was sent to Vintage V12 in the US for a rebuild, courtesy of SAAF Marine. They worked on this plane at Swartkops until 93, when it was moved to Atlas Aviation and became airworthy in September 1995. Painted as AXK from 1 Squadron, it flew from 95 with at least 2 groundings and an engine rebuild until it crashed in April 2000 at Zwartkops. It was found that the engine and some parts could be used for a rebuild. There is at the moment a process ongoing to rebuild AXK. It's a beautiful plane, like that sharp tail, teardrop canopy, clipped wings. And now the high point of the presentation. James Filleray was a SAAF pilot on course with John and Charles in 1981. He flew mostly helicopters. It's those funny things with a cooling fan on the top. And he was invited by Colonel Thomas to join the SAAF Museum flight and display the Spitfire. And this is the video that we couldn't show in the hangar, which I will now share with you.
Yeah. So what I thought to do is, well, at John's invitation as well, is to have a chat with somebody that's actually flown the Spitfire. As it turns out, James is also the youngest guy in South Africa that's probably flown the Spitfire. And with John's help here, let's have a bit of a chat and get to grips about what it was like. We always talk about us poor souls that's never flown these things, what we think it was and what we see in a flight simulator. But I suspect the real deal is actually quite different. So I'm here with James. I'm not going to try and pronounce his surname, and with John.
Yeah.
And together we're going to try and have a bit of a chat about flying the Spitfire. So James, just this introduction, how did you get to fly the Spitfire?
Yeah, well, I'd always done a bit of work with the Air Force Museum and historic flight. I'd flown a couple of their little light aircrafts. I'd actually flown the Chipmunk. The Chipmunk, incidentally, for normal operations around the circuit, up to 30 degrees of bank, just normal sort of handling, is actually very close to the Spitfire, in fact, which is interesting. But so I'd always been a bit involved with the museum, and I was an instructor at the helicopter flying school, and just got a phone call from Neil Thomas, who took over as the boss. He was looking for a 2IC, and he said, would I be interested? And I was due for a posting in 99, yeah. And he said, would you be interested? And I said, yes, that sounds I was quite intrigued. And then he said, you can be the display pilot on the Spitfire. Would you like that? And I said, is the Pope a Catholic? So that was quite something. And so that's how it came about. And I ended up being posted in there in 99. They were just getting it going again, because I think that year, or the previous year rather, they had that incredible incident where the crankshaft sheared. But it sheared in an angle. So luckily, it sort of locked itself almost. But of course, there was a slight difference in the timing of the pistons with the sheared crankshaft. So she ran really rough. But Dave Knudsen, to his credit, got it back to the airfield. And they fitted a new engine. That's another story. But this guy, Philip Vardis, his father, if I remember correctly, they ran a scrapyard in Pretoria, somewhere in that area. And he'd been one of these guys who had bought some surplus stuff after the war. And he literally had, I don't know, I think 2-3 Merlins still in their crates. And we actually swapped him 2 fully serviceable Harvards for a brand new Merlin engine, which, effectively a brand new Merlin. And they just got the Spit running again when I arrived.
Okay, just for more detail, I think we all know the Mark 9 Spitfire, the Evelyn that we saw when we grew up.
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about the museum one, which is a Mark 9 with a teardrop canopy and clipped wings. What was the numbers on it, the squadron numbers?
Yeah, well, it wasn't really, I think it was served with one squadron. It was certainly painted up in one squadron colors from the war. Mm-hmm. It was one of the gift of 135 odd, I think, that were given to South Africa after the war. There was a mixture of teardrop canopy and it actually sat as a gate guardian for, years as a gate guardian at Waterkloof before the museum got hold of it and slowly started rebuilding it. And they were mainly used to train the guys going to Korea. So most of them were based down at Longabon, I understand. They were painted in that sort of dark grey upper color scheme, and they were mostly used for weapons training.
Okay.
For guys going to Korea, yeah.
Okay, John, you can walk up and down, so I'm gonna,
John Lawrence.
I'm gonna need you for more some engine questions later on.
Yeah.
But tell me, James, so this is the Mark 9, so that would have been a Merlin 20?
Yeah, oh no, it was a Merlin 60, 70.
Sorry, Merlin, Merlin
70 series. And it was a Mark 9 because, of course, if you show anyone a picture of the aircraft, they'll say, oh, that's a Mark 16, which many were. But the Mark 16s, which looked exactly like that, were fitted with the Packard, the American-built engine.
Oh.
And the Packard engine used different bolt sizes and, nut sizes. And so the parts weren't, in fact, compatible with the Merlin. So to avoid a logistics nightmare, they called that the Mark 16. And then there were a couple of Mark 9s built with the teardrop canopy clip tips that were fitted with Merlin engines, and they were known as Mark 9s.
Okay.
So it literally was, the kind of engine it had, whether it was either a Mark 16 or a Mark 9.
Do you mind talking us through the startup procedure on the Spitfire?
Yeah,
I mean, we can. I'm going to do my presentation on all the technical, all the well, it's focused on static planes. So I think for us in the start, it was North Africa, it was Italy.
Yeah.
But how do you start the Spitfire?
Well, look, you're stretching my memory. This was a while back, but I think it's not a complex aeroplane. It's a good old piston with mixture, prop pitch, throttle. But as I recall, you did your normal kind of left to right checks, just work your way around the cockpit, and then you would prime it. I remember, I think it was about 8 shots of primer. It was a big engine. So
did it have a cartridge that you had to?
No. So it was electric start.
Okay.
So once you'd primed it, as I said, it had this auto rich, like an automatic mixture control. So you started it in idle cutoff, as I recall, and then because you had primed it, like I said, and cracked the throttle, usual thing, and then you switched on the 2 magnetos, and then it had these start and booster coil buttons. So if you press the start booster coil, it caused the tremble in the one coil, which increased the voltage, the sparks.
Okay.
Kind of like similar to light aircraft that have that magneto that has a little magnetic with a little spring-loaded system that flicks it around, and then once you hit the starters, it would start up quite easily, and then as soon as it fired, you whipped it to auto rich, and that was all you had to do, is just quickly move it to auto rich, and then that was it. It fired up.
It wouldn't idle.
Yeah.
Okay, so
We're going to take a break.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's do a quick break.
Yeah.
So, welcome back. So, what's happened in the meantime is James's old Impala instructor has joined us, and he's going to stand in judgment of how James reports back to us on flying the Spitfire. So, we've started up the Spitfire, now we're starting to taxi.
Yeah.
Now, in Impala, I'm sure it was easy to have the steering wheel. One button. But how about the Spitfire with that big engine?
Yeah. Well, no, it was, to go quickly back to the start though, if you primed it correct and had a set, you fired up very easily. I over-primed it once because I got distracted, and that's interesting because you have these 3-foot flames dancing all over the cowling, and jeepers, it seemed forever before it cleared and fired up. But anyway, taxiing it is not that hard. It's differential braking. But what works quite well is of course, on the Spits, you had the little circular stick and you had the little handbrake. And then there was an air valve like between your feet. So if you put full right rudder in and then hit the brakes, it would just end air pressure. Because of course, it was the beloved system the Brits have. They love using air pressure for brakes. The aircraft was interesting because air pressure operated the brakes. It operated the radiator flaps. And the flaps as well, the landing flaps. So that was all kind of air pressure. But the undercarriage was hydraulic. So it had this sort of mixture, if you like, of systems in a way. But you just put like full pedal in, and then you just had to, just squeeze the brake lever, and it would give you a bit of differential, which would, crack the tail wheel over, because it's a non-steerable tail wheel. Yeah. And then, so you basically, pretty much like the Impala, quite frankly, you use differential braking for tight turns. Otherwise, if you were going down the taxiway, you could almost just put full rudder in, and it would slowly answer to the rudder, but essentially differential braking,
Now we get to taking off.
Yeah.
So now we start talking about torque.
Yeah.
And guys flipping and.
Yeah, look, torque.
So how do you can't just slam it forward?
No,
no.
The imp, you used to just push the throttle forward really quickly. But no, that aircraft, yes, you would never just whack on. I mean, you're talking 1,650 horsepower, so you'd never whack it open. And another interesting thing, I mean, we flew it like pretty light. We would never use. I took off at, I think the most I ever used for takeoff was 8 pounds of boost. So the American boost is in inches mercury. This thing's in foot pounds or pounds of boost, pounds per square inch. Sorry, so I think the most I ever used was 8 pounds, which was more than enough. I mean, you could go to 12 pounds of boost. War emergency through the gate was 18 pounds of boost. I used to take off with 8 pounds, which was like plenty. Yeah. So you just let, you sort of smoothly roll the power on, and it was just, the tail would almost automatically come up to about 2 feet, the tail wheel, and you'd held it in that nose high attitude, and it was dead easy to just keep the spinner on the horizon. And just very simple, and she just automatically fly off at exactly 100 miles an hour.
It rotates on its own.
And just, I mean, you just hold the attitude, and she just gets airborne when the speed's right. And very easy to keep straight. It just did exactly what you wanted it to do. There was no drama. It was an amazing machine, for a high performance fighter.
So once you're in the air, now let's talk about you fighting Messerschmitts.
Luckily, I never had to do that. In fact, I'd like to say that you get a lot of guys who call themselves Spitfire pilots, and these guys in England and that. I don't think of myself at all like a Spitfire pilot. I think of myself as someone who's flown a Spitfire. Spitfire pilots were guys who put their lives on the line in combat. They were Spitfire pilots. And, I obviously maneuvered it and things like that. But I think in combat, all I can say is because the aircraft is so easy to fly, you devote very little energy or brain space to flying it. So you can devote a lot of your attention, your capacity can be spent outside the aircraft because it's so easy to fly, really.
That's an important point, I think, in flying.
I think that was the beauty of it. It really was an aircraft. You felt it was like a willing partner. You didn't. There wasn't any effort in flying it.
And the whole story about we know they had carburetors, not fuel injection.
Oh yeah. Well, look, the later carburetors were. To be honest, the exact technicality I'm not too sure of, but they called it an injection carburetor. But the first thing they did with that was what was that? John might even remember, but there was a lady engineer. Yes, what was it called? Something. Miss Simmons' orifice. Yeah. So she just put she literally just put a simple disc in the float bowl with a little hole in it, so that short period of negative G, the fuel couldn't. It had to drain through the hole. So it just kept the fuel supply going. It was as simple as that. And this was a lady engineer who came up with this idea. But later on, they had injection carbs, and it wasn't a problem with the later models. They pressurized the delivery, basically.
Yeah. So on the Mark 9, so we've now shot down a couple of Messerschmitts. Now we're coming into land. Anything different from a high performance plane like that to a high performance plane like today?
No, I think I will say, just to go back to the takeoff quickly, you took off with full right nose trim, which you wind off quite quickly after takeoff.
Okay.
In flight, the elevators were almost, it felt like they were at the point of overbalance, like the stick would hunt slightly as you flew, like backwards and forwards. They were very powerful, and the rudder was ridiculous. You just never touched the rudder in flight. It was incredibly powerful.
And the different in pressure applied to
Yeah,
to elevate the rudder ailerons
movement.
how were they in
Well,
sequence?
Sort of the ratio.
Yeah, the ratio, the ratio, look, I'd almost say maybe not totally perfect. I mean, you always go, what is it? I think it's, 1 to 2 to 4, the rudder being the stiffest, but, people say the Spitfire was like a bit too sensitive in elevator, which I don't know if I don't think that's a problem in a fighter, but, I think I find it pretty good, the harmony, the control harmony at the end of the day. The ailerons, yes, maybe were a little bit heavy, but I mean, I'd hardly, at the speeds I flew at, as well. Remember, I never wound it up to, we babied the airplane, so we never wound it up to high speed. I never found the ailerons really getting any heavier at the speeds we flew at. But I would really say, the ailerons were probably the heaviest, although they still felt great. The elevators were very powerful, and like I said, the rudder was crazy. You just didn't even touch it in straight and level flight. It was exceptionally powerful.
So easy for deflection.
Yeah, I mean,
Shooting,
just like you hardly touched it. Landing, of course, was a different story. Then you did use it and take off a bit. But in flight, at speed, the rudder was extremely powerful. I actually tried to see what would happen if I had a rudder trim failure. And I actually locked my leg, but the rudder pedal came back and just pushed me up the seat, even with my harness quite tight. It was, I quickly wound it off, but you'd have to whip the nose up and keep the speed down. It was very powerful when the speed started building up.
Wow.
But, so again, control wise, one of the reasons the aircraft felt also very easy to fly was it had the broken stick. So your ailerons were just the top part of the stick, and then the elevators were the whole stick. So unlike the Harvard, it didn't feel like your hand was really moving around the cockpit. It was just making these very small movements, which made it really nice as well. It felt like you weren't moving the stick, and the aircraft was just doing what you wanted it to do. Which it's amazing, yeah. It's
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, so
The landing, sorry, you talked about the landing. I can quickly tell you, landing was no big deal at the end of the day. The undercarriage, you just had to be nice and smooth with it, not rush it. And then landing it, one of the nice things about landing is that with that broad elliptic wing and the split flaps, when you put the flaps, you only had flat up or down. There was no intermediate setting. So you selected down, it went down to 64 degrees, like just an air brake almost. But that wide wing, it would really pitch nose down, a significant nose down pitch. And after a while, it was a kind of aircraft, very quickly I was able to, on base leg, just select flat down. She pitched down into a perfect sort of curved approach, and I didn't have to touch the power again. It would just come down with the flap. So that nose down pitch was actually quite nice as you put the flap down, and then holding it off, I just hold it off in that exact attitude. You touch down, which would happen almost naturally. She touched down on the mains with the tail about 2 feet off the ground.
Oh, wow.
And just easy as that. And then look, on the after landing roll with the throttle at idle, so you got no slipstream. A little bit busy on the rudder, but not nothing that, I never landed it in a strong crosswind, because as I said, we flew when the conditions were good in that.
Yeah.
I think in a strong crosswind, it could have got a little bit interesting, but normal conditions, I just let it roll to the end of the runway, and it was no problem keeping it straight, really. You just wanted to catch a swing very early. You didn't want to let anything develop with that big nose,
So do you think that?
the narrow gears, I never really was conscious of the narrow gear, but yeah, that is a factor for sure. Yeah.
There is a factor, okay. Do you think that nose down, when flaps went down, was sort of caused some accidents before?
No, I wouldn't say it really caused accidents. I mean, it helped you, fly the approach really. Because the nose was big. That curved approach wasn't showboating. I came back from doing a fly past at Ananda Club for the Battle of Britain Day. And I kind of joined on a long final for Swartkops for 02. And I mean, I don't know, I couldn't have been more than a mile away. if not even closer, and the whole airfield, I couldn't see it. It was completely hidden behind the nose. I had to turn away
Wow.
and put myself on a base leg to fly that curved approach, because you just can't see across that huge nose.
Big engine, yeah.
Yeah, you know, and yeah, it's a big nose.
John, what do you think? Your
Yeah.
old pupil. Did
Well,
he say the right things? You think
Certainly surprised, but I would have known that.
no,
you.
look, I really enjoyed flying with John. He was very nice to me, actually, probably nicer than what I deserved.
James, thank you. We're at John's house, and thanks for the hospitality, and thanks for having the chat with us. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay, and that bring us to the last slide, which is ultimately what happened to the Spitfires.